Hi everyone, welcome to class with Professor Mead. Today we're going to talk about race. What we're going to be talking about today is race and ethnicity. Specifically, what's the difference between race and ethnicity, the difference between racism and prejudice. We're going to talk about whether race is a social construction or a reality. We're going to talk about where the definitions of race and ethnicity largely come from, which institutions, how they help to construct race, what the real name of the census is, because we've all been calling it by a wrong name, and how do biologists versus sociologists define race, and then how does a biologist define race versus how they would define something like a population, and then what's an ideology. So race and ethnicity in society are terms that are used interchangeably, but within academia and within research, these are two distinct definitions. Race is a group that's treated as distinct in society because of certain perceived characteristics that have been defined by that society as superior or inferior. And what that means is that we look at someone, we make assumptions about what kind of biological characteristics they have, their skin color, their eye shape, their hair texture, those types of things. And then we make a decision about what racial category or group we would put them in. For this reason, race is largely defined by how other people perceive you, unless you live in between kind of two different racial groups physically in a way that makes you markedly understand that you can be largely placed into a wrong category or group easily. And that may not have anything to do with your ancestry, your biology, your history, your culture, any of those things. So race is, from an outside perspective, our society telling us who they think we are based on characteristics that we have that they're perceiving to be biological in nature and connected to these concepts of race that we have. Ethnicity, on the other hand, takes into account more your shared common culture and your shared identity. So whose culture are you invested in? Which culture, which identity do you carry in terms of how you see yourself in your ethnicity or your race? And this, on the other hand, even though often it might be externally assigned to us, in other words, our society says, oh, you are this racial group, and we identify with that racial group and we identify with that culture and that history. So that's both externally assigned, but also more self-imposed. But they're not necessarily linked to race. Somebody can look at someone else and say, okay, well, they are Black. But that person, if you ask them what their ethnicity is, they may tell you they're Hispanic. And so what happens is that your ethnicity, you almost have more control over, right? We have more control over identifying with our shared common culture that we have. If you grow up in a Hispanic culture, if you speak Spanish in the home, if you celebrate holidays in that way, you're going to identify with that culture, with that ethnicity. It doesn't matter what your biology necessarily looks like, right? But people still will say, well, no, you are white, or you are Black, or you are Asian, right? Even though you may identify yourself as Hispanic. That's why we say other people impose our racial group on us, but it's externally assigned, but our ethnicity is more self-imposed. And they don't have to be linked in terms of our racial group. Think about the person who, they may be biologically Chinese, right? Their parents moved to Mexico, they are born in Mexico, they grow up there. And where I come from Ensenada, from my family comes from at least, There's a lot of fishermen, right? So there's a lot of Chinese fishermen that have been there for generations. They consider themselves to be Mexican. They speak Spanish, of course, fluently because they're born and raised, right, with that tongue. And they are ethnically Mexican while they may absolutely 100% look racially Chinese. So that's where you see that they may not be necessarily linked to each other, those kinds of situations. Another thing that's interesting is that it can go over time. Your ethnicity can actually change, and you can opt into or out of an ethnicity. That may sound strange, but this is how it works. So maybe you're raised within Vietnamese culture, right? And you might even look more like you are Hispanic or white than you look like you're Vietnamese. And as you grow older, you marry someone else who is white. You celebrate those different holidays. Say maybe they're Germanic, they celebrate those holidays. You start to celebrate and see from that German culture. Maybe you move to Germany. You speak German fluently. Your children are, German and Vietnamese. Racially, you have opted into another ethnicity. Your family, your friends, your culture, all of that is part of your ethnicity. And so we, in some sense, have more control over that. That's what I find to be very. Okay, so let's go back to race for a second. Race is a social construction according to academics of all types and specifically to sociologists. We identify racial groups through these different types of academic and political and social definitions that have been created over time and have changed. So what I want to do is I want to take you back for a minute in time and talk about different racial categories and where they originally come from, so you can see how it changes over time. So going back into the 1700s, people believed that race was not only biological in nature, like heavily biological in nature, but that it was based on blood differences. Think about like blood types and how people will say that you have certain attributes based on your blood types. This is the way that they were thinking. So in the 1700s, 1735, Carl Linnaeus, he classified four distinct categories that he says are Homo sapiens: Europeans, American Indians, Asians, and Africans. You were one of those four categories, nothing else, right? By 1776, we have Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, and he changes the definition slightly. This is only about 50 years later. Think about that. That's within people's lifetime. But his categories were Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian, America, and Malay. Malay, right? You're thinking, what's Malay? Malay is a category, obviously, that we don't use anymore. You could consider it to be like maybe islanders, possibly Pacific Islanders, people from different continents, somewhere between like what we would consider Asian and Pacific Islander today. But by the time we hit the 1900s, the 19th and the 20th century, we have this huge investment in these categories of race as this kind of scientific anthropology, right? And so there was a lot of effort to categorize people, measure their brains, measure their skulls, measure the width of their nose, and then to try to categorize people on these different assessments that they were making. We were looking at it as though they were physical traits and that people were biologically humans or subspecies of humans from this perspective. And we were making those assessments primarily within academia based upon a racial bias. If you start with the Caucasian male as being the superior, quote unquote, most, I guess you could say, like highest level of human species, They would then categorize other people based on their physical characteristics. Again, their perceived biological characteristics. They don't have to be real biological characteristics. And then we were putting them into categories. But unfortunately, these categories had more to do with the social constructions of reality around race than they did actual biology. Moving even further, really not further in time, but into this type of what we now call scientific racism, we come up with theories on eugenics and ethnology, essentially saying that there are different types of categories or groups of people who are biologically superior, and if we try to eliminate certain categories or groups of people by either forced, killing them or forced abortions or those types of things, then we could promote a better racial lineage in the future. And this again comes from those very core basist presumptions of superiority and inferiority based on where people already stand on the social class ladder, right? Those who have power and wealth would be perceived as the most biologically superior, and those who have lack power and wealth would be perceived as biologically inferior. We're conflating the social with the biological. Today we understand that's absolutely not the case. That is not even how Darwin perceived biological superiority or Darwinism. From his perspective, the person who has the most children is the most biologically superior because they would have the most of their offspring to go into the future. So let's keep going based on some of this, right? So we know, just like everything else or every other type of biological animal on this planet, human variability, most of our human variability, genetically speaking, comes within our own racial groups. And if you look at what we perceive today as distinct racial categories or groups, there is almost no racial variation between those categories of groups. Now, there is racial variation among human beings as a whole, but most of that is between individuals from all racial categories, not between groups that we would consider to be distinct racial categories. In addition to that, our genetic overlap as human beings is somewhere between 99 and 99.9%. In other words, we are mostly genetically the same, and the variation that we see in our hair or our skin color, our body shape, those types of things are simply a matter of genetic variation that happens within all species. Does not mean that that racial group or that species has distinct categories within it that we would consider to be race today. Now, it's not just academia as an institution that played a huge part in the social construction of race and our racial categories today. It is also the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB. So before you get upset with them, they're not doing anything wrong or bad, but when you get your census and you check the classifications, what racial group you are, that's not the census, that's the Office of Management and Budget. They're the ones that do the census. We just call it the census, right? So the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, specifically says about their racial categories, these classifications should not be interpreted as scientific or anthropological in nature, period, right? But what happens is, because they are a social structure, an institution within our society that has a huge sway in how we perceive reality, their categories become cemented into our culture as real. Now, the OMB themselves is saying that these categories are not real scientifically or anthropologically in nature, but they can be real in their consequences, and they very much are real in their consequences. Therefore, race is both a social construction and a reality, because we make it a reality through our social constructions, our belief in the ideology of race. Ideology simply means that we are, as a society, believing in an idea, and we believe in the idea commonly of race, right? We make the presumption that there's these racial categories, and they have very real consequences in our everyday lives and in our connection or lack of connection or access to resources, right? So our connection to institutions, how those institutions relate to us, how they treat us, how much access they give us, or how much access they have to our lives. So race is both a social construction and a reality. Okay, I was almost done, and I was gonna go ahead and just delete it and start over. But what I was trying to say, I decided not to. What I was trying to say was that people from like different parts of the world, Egypt, Iran, Iraq, people from that part of the world were also petitioning to have their own category. That did not work out in 1997, so we may see that in the future. And then in 1997, Hispanics are regarded as an ethnic group with their race identified separately. So in 1997, I go from being Hispanic to being white Hispanic ethnicity. So my race technically changes in 1997. Do I change? Who I am changes? No. Also, you're allowed multiple attempts. Now, think about this. People today do identify, a lot of times people, especially younger people, will identify with multiple racial groups. And so when you ask somebody, they'll even tell you 2 or 3 or 4 different groups that they identify with. If you go and you talk to your grandparents, right, or people who came of age in, prior to the 1970s, they will likely only give you one racial group if you ask them what their race is. And that has, in large part, is due to the OMB, and the OMB allowing us to choose multiple entries. We may not even realize what that is. But that's the interplay between institutions and us as individuals, and how these social constructions of different ideologies like race come to become popularized in our understanding within our larger or broader society. So sometimes, I will leave out this portion. I have tried to not talk about the DNA so much, because when I talk about the DNA, students get stressed. They think, I didn't want biology lessons. I thought this was a social class, right? But if I leave the DNA out here, or if we don't talk about biology here, a lot of times students will say, yes, but I don't believe you because, DNA, right? Everybody can take a DNA test. So let's talk about this, right? So if race is a social construction, then how do we explain DNA tests? How do we explain that you can swab your mouth and they can, you can send that off in the mail, and they can send you back something in the mail that tells you what racial groups you belong to? Well, what they're actually doing is not giving you a racial group, they're giving you a population group. And so according to biologists, right, because they're actually using the definitions from biologists here when you send off to 23andMe or whatever type of DNA group that you want to send off to, they're using the terms population, but talking to you about it in terms of race. And the reason why we do that is because through the media or through larger society, we believe that if you use the technical terms, populations, people are going to get confused. People know what we mean when we say race. But when a biologist says race, he actually means this definition: an imprecise term generally used to refer to a group of people who differ physically or culturally from one's group. Sound familiar? That sounds like the sociologist one, right? And then they add only a small fraction of variation in DNA produces biological distinctions, right? DNA testing is a mark of populations, according to biologists, not race. So according to biologists, populations, the term populations, is what we would consider to be really ethnicity. A group of people who are identified by geographical or linguistic characteristics. Meaning that if you go back in time, you spoke the same language and you lived in the same region as these other people who could be categorized into that group. So you remember the racial categories with the OMB, also known as the Office of Management and Budget, right? The census. They had 5-6 categories, but for biologists, for populations, they have 6,000-ish categories. They're actually growing quite quickly now, the categories of populations, because of things like 23andMe, those DNA tests. So we can follow the linguistic and geographic lineage of people based on their DNA. That's what we understand culturally to be race. That's not race. That's populations, according to biologists, ethnicity, according to sociologists. So the Human Genome Project was started in the 1990s, and the original goal for them was to get a sample size of 25 people from about 5,000 to 6,000 populations across the world. There were a ton of financial and political issues. There were a lot of countries who just outright refused to offer any DNA samples. A lot of the DNA samples that they did have came from existing cell lines. There were about 1,000 of those, and they offered them 52 sampled populations. And they knew that their repository was very deficient, and they were trying to get cell lines from all these different providers, and they were really having a difficult time. What changed the game is they actually started to sell the sample requests. So today, we essentially offer our DNA for the price of $99, usually, right? It's about $100. To give a group or a organization our DNA sample. They used to have to ask people and pay people to get their DNA. Now we pay these organizations to take our DNA, and they often use them or share them with other people without our consent. Once you pay them, you're giving them consent. They own your DNA cell line. So the sample size has grown dramatically since the 1990s because of that. All right, let's talk about prejudice and racism. So the way that you want to understand this from an academic perspective is largely you can think of prejudice on a micro level, but racism on a macro level. So if you think about individual attitudes that people have, their preconceived notions about groups that people have, that's prejudice. When you start to have power, either power through a large number of people or power because that one individual holds a ton of power, that prejudice becomes racism. When prejudice becomes racism, that means that either that one person has enough power to impact access for groups to resources on a massive level, or those individuals with those micro level attitudes, those prejudicial attitudes, there's enough of those people so that it can start to shape the thoughts and perceptions of those groups, and therefore either limit their access to resources or grant them more power, or pull away their individual rights as human beings, right? That would then be racism again, right? So the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, it says that language shapes our thoughts and perceptions of the world. So when we talk to people or talk about groups of people in certain ways, in the media, individually, as a grandpa sitting in his lounge chair on Thanksgiving, now that Thanksgiving is coming up, and has all these things to say about these different racial groups, individually, that grandpa is just prejudice. All of the grandpas that do that together and talk about groups in a certain way and have those prejudicial attitudes in a way that can largely affect other groups within society, even their own group, because they're all sharing those similar ideologies. That's racism. I know this is complicated and convoluted a little. We'll try to keep going and see if you're able to distinguish. So I like to think about race usually on a macro level, because that's the easier way to think about it. Racism does not need individuals to be prejudiced in order for groups within society based on their racial category to lack access to a resource, or to be blocked from an institution, or to receive a disparity in access based on the category that we would identify them with. So let's talk about that for a minute. Let me give you an example that should help. If you largely lack access to a living wage, the economy, right, or credit, if your access to credit changes based on your category of race that you are in other words, you get higher credit scores or more credit because of a racial group that you belong to, or you're denied access to credit or to purchasing a home in a certain neighborhood because of a racial group that you belong to, that's institutionalized racism. When we give more funding to schools with certain racial groups and less funding to schools with other racial groups, that's institutionalized racism. And you might be thinking, okay, well, that doesn't exist anymore. We don't do redlining anymore, right? We don't do that in our mortgages, and we don't do that in schools. No, we just call it by a different name. So we still draw the lines around the houses that ultimately result in one school being almost completely of one racial group and another school being almost completely of another racial group. And those children may actually live side by side in the same neighborhood, even on the same street, but they go to different schools. And when you look at the school, the result is racial, right? It doesn't matter if it started that way. It matters what the result is. So if you have unequal access based on race to a good education, to healthy food in your markets, to access to healthcare, then that is institutionalized racism. Why are we seeing more Black and brown people die from coronavirus? That's because historically, Black and brown people have had less access to the economy. They have had, which meant that they are not able to get the same access to mortgage and credit, which also means that they live in communities that have less access to healthy food, i.e. food deserts, or which is the opposite of access to grocery stores. They have almost no hospitals in their communities. If they do have a hospital, it is very different, right, in terms of the resources that they have. They also have less access to education. And all of those institutional kind of barriers that you might face or you might have more access to based on your racial group, those are going to change an outcome when something like a pandemic occurs. And so the result is a racist result from a sociological perspective. You don't need your grandma or your grandpa or your neighbor to have the prejudicial beliefs if the result is that those groups have more access or less access to any type of institution based on the category from which they belong. So we've been talking about it in terms of race. And I have been saying Black or brown people or white people or Asians or Hispanics, right? But largely when we talk about this, when we talk about it with our family and our friends, even when we talk about it in academia especially, we want to talk about it from the terms that we would use in academia. It's dominant groups and minority groups. So it's not minority and majority group, because the elite, according to Marx, right, they're the dominant group. They're smaller. They're a minority population-wise, but they're the dominant group because they hold the access to all the power and almost all of the economic resources in this world. And so they are the dominant group. So anywhere in which you are the one who has more access, you're the dominant group. But anywhere where you are the one that has less access to power and resources, you're in the subordinate or minority group. So, I mean, we often think about it in terms of race, right? So we could say people who are white are in the dominant group and people of color are in the minority group. Men, though, are in the dominant group in terms of sex. Women are in the subordinate group in terms of sex. Able-bodied people are in the dominant group. People with disabilities are in the subordinate group. Heterosexuals are in the dominant group. The queer community as a whole is in the subordinate group, right? So you see kind of the differences here. This way we can talk about them with more precise definitions. Ooh. So the discussion writing workshop that would have been, there were I would say 6 reviews and discussions in this lecture. So it's actually a quite long lecture in the classroom. You see here it's still 30 minutes long. And I took out probably 6 slides that are the things that you would do on your activities. But I just want to show you here that in addition to those other in-class activities that your classmates would have done had they been taking this on campus, they would have also had to do this discussion and writing workshop. So they would have discussed the following questions, which were your think, pair, share questions. You guys do this every week as well. And then they would have actually had to write the answers and turn it in anyways. I like to show you guys because I want you to see you're not doing more or less than my students on campus. You're just doing it in a different way. So that's it for today. This is your reluctant YouTube professor. For myself, this is probably one of the most emotionally draining lectures that I give. The one next week is really hard too. Also, if you made it all the way to the end, little quick note for you. This chapter and the next chapter are not based on the book chapters at all. I find them to be quite outdated. And so this is some of the more modern stuff that I want you guys to know to bring you into sociology in the future, especially if you plan on going into sociology as a major. I hope you will. And have a great day. Bye.